Everyone, welcome back to Leosophy. Now we're covering the second part of the philosophy series. God, I need a haircut. My flipping cowlicks are just out of the control, man. Anyway, we're going to be talking about cynicism. And cynicism, as I mentioned previously, is my favorite of the philosophies, Hellenistic philosophies. And even starting is difficult. Obviously, the bulk of this is going to be talking about Diogenes, who is mainly the reason why I love Cynicism so much. But I compared Buddhism to Stoicism, and I think a lot could be said about Hinduism and Cynicism, because some of the inspiration for the Cynic view seems to be the ascetics of India, and that shouldn't come as a surprise. There was a lot of cultural exchange between India and ancient Greece at the time. In fact, it's been argued, and I absolutely agree with this, that Heracles, aka Hercules, was really just Vajra. And if you look at statues, like ancient Greek statues of Hercules, and then you look at ancient Indian statues of Vajra, it's like that they're the same guy. The similarities are just a little too much. It's not just a question of archetypes, it's a question of direct influence. But a lot of Hindu ascetics, they would slowly, or sometimes abruptly, just eschew every comfort and live in a very unpleasant kind of existence, homeless, without any decent food. Sometimes they would eat incredibly small portions of incredibly bland or even revolting, rotting food, and one of them might stand on one leg all day. Well, you can see all this now. If you go to India now, you can find ascetics who live like that. That seemed to have an influence on Socrates, one of his best pupils, actually, Antisthenes. And Antisthenes founded Cynicism. And there's a lot of confusion about the term Cynicism, by the way, because, the word comes from the root for dog. And the Cynics believe in living like the Stoics. They talked about living as close to nature as possible, living the most natural life. Well, they took it to a level that the Stoics would find rather repugnant. They would start eschewing everything, just living almost in an animalistic manner. Some people think that's where the term comes from, that they lived like dogs. Other people think that it's because they held on to an argument like a dog does a bone. Presumably, if you debated a Cynic, they would not let a little thing go and let you move on to another topic. You had to address whatever they were debating you with, particularly Diogenes. And then another reason, Diogenes himself said that he was very much like a dog. He said he would fawn over those who were kind to him and bite those who weren't. And he definitely did do that. He would troll some of the other philosophers to a degree that I think that's one of the reasons why I love Diogenes is some of the things that he did. I'll go ahead and get those out of the way before I talk any further, because otherwise it's going to keep being brought up. He would go to these symposiums that other individuals had, other philosophers had. By the way, he was a pupil of Cynicism. A lot of people think Diogenes started it, but as I've mentioned before, Antisthenes started it, and Antisthenes was a pupil of Socrates. I think that's very important, that there's kind of a lineage. It kind of actually reminds me of, like, you look at the lineage of, like, different kung fu schools in China. These master-to-pupil lessons were just very important to Greek philosophy, like an unbroken cord. And so Cynicism doesn't just come out of nowhere. It has a very prominent root in that sense. But I feel like, what was I going to say? Oh, he would go to the symposiums, Diogenes would, and he would piss on people's carpets, and he would show up, and I'm trying to think of who it was specifically. Was it Sophocles, or was it Plato? I think it just about had to be Sophocles. Yeah, I'm fairly certain. At one point he said, "What is a man?" They were debating that, and Sophocles said, "A man is just a bipedal bird with no feathers." And he shows up at his party one day, uninvited, and it pisses on his rug. Says, "I piss on the vanity That's a very big thing for Diogenes, the vanity of Sophocles. And hang on just a sec, guys. It was Plato. It was Plato. I was thinking that was unlikely because some people even thought that Plato was like, what do you call it? Not really a tulpa, but more like an alter ego of Socrates. I've actually heard some people argue that. But anyway, he would go and he would piss on his carpet and say, I piss on Plato's vanity. And he would troll him about the bird and everything. And three other stories really intrigue me about him. To bear in mind, Cynicism is about living as simply as humanly possible, to a point that's almost animalistic, right? The cup of Diogenes is an interesting story, where he had eschewed all possessions except this wine barrel he was living in, and a cup. And he would take the cup down to the fountain, town square, and he would fill it up, and he would use that to drink. And then one day, a child runs up, I think it was a little girl, if I remember right, runs up and cups her hands and drinks from the fountain. And he says, a child has outdone me at simplicity. And then he threw his cup away and never used that again. And at that point, his only possessions were really the clothes on his back and the barrel, the wine barrel, which barrels back then were clay, so don't imagine like a big oak barrel. That's what he lived in. And then on another instance, this goes hand in hand with the whole dog-like thing that I was telling you all about. Diogenes of Cynicism was sitting in his barrel, and see, this shows the difference between the different philosophies. He became aroused. Now, a Stoic would have simply denied that. They would have simply thought, well, that's just a passing, fleeting series of reactions that will pass with time, and I don't need to worry about that. And then a hedonist, on the other hand, would have just gone out and found a prostitute. You see where that goes, the different ways of viewing it. Bear in mind, he's got a big hole in his barrel, so everybody can see him. Diogenes just starts cranking it. And he was, of course, arrested for public indecency. They take him to court, and he says one of the funniest things I've ever heard anybody say ever. They say, do you have anything to say for yourself? And he says, wouldn't it be great if you could stop being hungry by rubbing your belly? So that was how he viewed it. He had a need and he took care of it. And by his view, and it may sound as if, well, they must have these lax morals. It's completely different from Stoicism. Well, for his perception, what he did, again, totally different from the way everybody else would have thought. And that's the most interesting thing about him. I mean, he really was just a square peg in a round hole. He was nothing like your standard Greek. His views were just out there. The way he saw it, if he'd gone out and sought a prostitute, that would have been immoral. Because one, he would have been wasting resources that could have been used, for example, to help the poor. Instead, he's paying a prostitute. Two, could be spreading venereal disease. Could get her pregnant, and now you've got a child born to that kind of suffering lifestyle. So he saw that, and then additionally, it's a form of exploitation of another human being. So you see how that works? It's a completely different view of things, which is why he lived the way he did. It was just so far removed from anything we would expect today, or even then. Like I said, he was brought up on charges. I don't think he actually served time for it, though. And another funny story, this is just how funny he was. I mean, this is like a 3,000-year-old burn, and it's still funny. And that amazes me. You watch a comedy movie in the 60s, it's like, oh, this isn't funny anymore. Then you hear this. This is awful, but gosh, there was a young boy who was the son of a prostitute, incidentally, and he was throwing rocks in the actual town square. Diogenes sees him doing this, and he says, take care, boy, you might hit your father. It's so awful, but it's so funny, though. Like, to think that somebody could come up with something like that on the fly. The most famous story, though, that illustrates his view of the world, this is easily the most famous, much more so than the cup, much more so than the trial, much more so than the stone throwing or any of this other stuff. And that is when, presumably, and again, a lot of this stuff is hearsay, and it could be myth at this point, because we don't have very accurate sources during this period. I mean, heck, accurate historicity really didn't start until, I mean, it's actually debatable if we even have it now, but I mean, really trying to be objective, that's just a few centuries old. But presumably, Alexander the Great was in town, and he'd heard stories about this, amazing philosopher Diogenes of Sinope. So he goes to see him, and there's Diogenes laying beside his barrel that he lived in, just basking in the sunshine, just laying there. And he introduces himself. He's like, "I'm Alexander the Great, conquering the world. I will grant you whatever you wish for, your reputation, whatever that, in recognition of your merit." You get the idea. And he says, "What is it that you, Diogenes, want?" And Diogenes looks up at him and says, "I want you to move. You're blocking the sunshine." And instead of having his head lopped off, he left him to be. And later he asked, or he mentioned to a confidant or something, he said, "I like being Alexander the Great, but if I were not Alexander the Great, I wouldn't mind being Diogenes of Sinope." And it goes hand in hand with kind of Stoicism as well. I mentioned Stoicism is about how you react to things, how things make you feel and think in response, because you can control how you feel and think. That's the biggest flaw with modern views of the world, is we think we're in control of our actions, and we're in control of all these factors out in the world that we have no control over, but we can't control how we feel. Don't make me happy when I am sad. That view. And it's like, that's completely the opposite. You can control how you react to things. You can control how you feel in response to things. You can control your mind and your emotions with work and effort. I mean, it's not an inherent thing, but you can control those things. It's the things that you think you can control that you don't. Stoics try to view that via meditation and detachment. Cynics try to control how they think and feel by just eschewing things that they view as unnecessary, which Diogenes was very quick to call all that vanity. If you wanted a house, well, you're just vain and greedy. You just want people to say, "Oh, we've got a nice house." Oh, you want a lovely, virtuous wife. You just want people to talk about your lovely, virtuous wife. You're just succumbing to a combination of avarice and lust. That was how he viewed things. He stripped everything bare. The Stoics would strip things bare mentally. He would strip things bare in action. And that's why he lived the way he did. He lived in a wine barrel. He took more pleasure in sunbathing than most people would in a sumptuous feast. And that's one of the reasons why I'm just utterly fascinated with him. As I've mentioned in my agrarianism primer, a simple urban lifestyle is guaranteed just about, unless you're a very peculiar personality type, to make you happier, to make you live better, living in accordance with nature, living in a community that supports you, etc. It ties in with that. Cynicism, they eschewed everything in favor of just living free in the way they wanted to. And there's something very admirable about that. I think that everyone, if they analyze Cynics, they come to two conclusions. One, I could never do that. And two, I admire that. And Diogenes is just a great example of that kind of lifestyle. And it's interesting, in Sinope, I think, which is his hometown, they built a statue to honor him, and it's a statue of him standing next to a dog, because Cynicism is associated with dogs. So it's just a fascinating point of view. That what's strangest about it, though, is the view of shame. They really try to push shame out of it. That's the thing about Stoics. Stoics don't care about their reputation the way your average Greek would, but the Cynics would go to lengths that seem, again, you see it with Hindu ascetics, that would be viewed as shameful and disgusting. In fact, there was actually a kind of an analogy to describe that at one point. It was something like Antisthenes was walking down the street, and he saw a woman that he liked, and so he immediately just proceeded to just mount her and have intercourse with her right there in the street. And then his disciples saw this and covered them with a cloak. And that was the difference between a Cynic and a Stoic. Is the disciple is being a Stoic, and the master is being a Cynic. And by the way, I don't think that really happened. That it's just used as a metaphor to illustrate it. And nobody, please don't assume I'm talking about him like, assaulting someone. Presumably it would be just two individuals acting like animals, and then a third acting a little bit more like a person. And so that really sums up Cynicism. But it's so unfortunate. Like I said, in modern times, what does a Cynic mean? somebody who sees the worst in people, somebody who sees the worst in situations, basically a pessimist, someone who thinks that people are motivated by their most base desires. Well, that's not cynicism at all. It almost seems like all of these philosophies, they're the opposite of what modern definitions claim they are. I sometimes feel, and this may be paranoia on my part, I feel almost as if it's intentional, if it's a way to denigrate these points of view because they do uplift people. They make people less like livestock and more like people. And I have no proof that that's what's going on, but I find it very strange and telling that the real wonderful and fascinating meanings behind these points of view are being disparaged so much by common parlance. They're nothing like what the real meaning is. And cynicism is no exception. Cynicism is a fascinating, borderline ascetic way of life that I encourage everyone to study. So that's all I'm going to cover on cynicism. Next time I think I'm covering nihilism. Yeah, so stay tuned for nihilism. Thanks everybody. Like, subscribe. Bye.